Hey everybody, Donut DM here with my first tanking video in the how-to series that actually applies it to the first dungeon, Sastasha. So why don't we go ahead and get right into it. I'm going to be using this video as an introduction to tanking for people who are new to tanking in Final Fantasy XIV, or for those who are new to tanking in general. So I'm going to show the whole dungeon for this one. Notice that I immediately make sure my tank stance Royal Guard is activated. I'm going to be showing the whole video for this one. Any future guides for dungeons are just going to be the important bits, any surprise mechanics, the bosses, just the core gameplay. So you see I did my ranged attack, hold into 2 AoEs, and then start cycling through my single target combo. This is the technique that I'll be using to pull everything. This is the same technique that was covered in my How to Tank Basics, so if you missed that and you were just jumping straight in, it's really all you need to know for this dungeon. Up ahead, if you go straight along this path, there's a bloodied memo that tells you a color for a crystal in the future. But while you guys watch just this basic tanking, I'm going to go ahead and start talking about some important aspects to tanking that a lot of people don't think about. One important thing is knowing what your healers are capable of in terms of what their class can do and what kind of gear they have, to see if maybe they're undergeared, maybe they're overgeared. Like for this dungeon I have an Astrologian. If this were a higher level dungeon where they have all their abilities, Astrologians give good party-wide buffs. They have pretty good burst healing, decent sustained healing. So if I were to do larger pulls of enemies, an Astrologian would hold up just fine and be able to sustain through the entire dungeon. Now, if it was a Scholar, they focus more on shields and preparatory healing and just overall damage reduction. So if I were to utilize my defensive cooldowns a lot more with a Scholar, that helps you mitigate a lot of the damage so your healer doesn't even need to heal you as much. White Mage is just good burst healing, good sustained healing. You can really throw a White Mage into any scenario and they'll be able to heal you. So you can always be comfortable with whatever you're doing with a White Mage. They can just fill every single role you need for a healer. So you're gonna see up here for Sastasha, there's just weird bit with all these floaty mites and giant clams. The Shade Seekers don't really do much. You can just grab them and then focus on the clam. It's not that big of a deal. So I'm not going to get into too much detail right now because this is going to be its own separate video, but it is important to learn when you can do smaller pulls of enemies and be perfectly fine, and when you should be doing bigger pulls of enemies. You're never really punished for doing a small pull, but a lot of people doing dungeons with you are probably doing so via a roulette. They just want to get done as soon as possible. So doing bigger pulls is kind of a courtesy thing to those who are just trying to get the dungeon done as fast as you can. They don't care about pull clears, and if you can handle it, there's no reason not to do a big pull. The things to watch out for is if you notice the healer is struggling to keep up with you, you're starting to lose aggro, just don't even try doing big pulls at that point. It's just a lot safer for the whole party if you just keep the smaller groups of enemies. Another interesting part of tanking, I'm not going to say it's a fun or important part of tanking, is you're kind of expected to be the leader of the party. So one of the most important aspects in a lot of people's minds that's not really necessity, just expected, is that the tank is the one that's supposed to know the dungeon. So you're supposed to look up guides like this one be able to lead anybody who's new through the entire scenario. Yeah, it gets a little bit painful at times. But what you can do is, if you have a group of friends and you want to learn, you know, some dungeons before you start farming them, tanking, what you'll do is you'll queue up for the dungeon with a undersized party, and it'll be just you and your friends going into it with whatever level you're at. Your gear won't be level synced down. And you can take your time and explore through the dungeon and figure out the different mechanics without worrying about, you know, maybe there's a massive burst damage ability the boss has, but since you're a level 50 doing a level 36 dungeon, it doesn't do that much to you, so you don't have to worry about it if you mess it up. That's one good way to learn dungeons. I've been doing it recently with some of the hard dungeons that I never got around to completing the first time around. So earlier in the dungeon, you can see somebody said the color was green on the crystal, so you'll go up and you'll hit, I guess it's coral, not crystal, but they'll go up, hit the green coral, and a button will appear, and once somebody hits that button, the boss shows up. This is the first boss you'll be fighting as a tank. The only important thing to keep in mind is don't stand in its AoE, and if you can stun it out of its ability here, Charged Whisker, then that's great. Or you can just step aside and wait. You lose a little bit of DPS, but nobody's going to judge you. And you just keep smacking away at it. It's pretty quick, pretty easy. You can see, I think it's right here, I accidentally turn off my tank stance. And this will be a good example of why you always keep your tank stance on coming up. Because I don't have it, I do lose aggro on a couple of enemies, just right up around this corner. So keep in mind, you can be a good tank without tank stance and still lose aggro. Moving on to another important aspect of tanking is one of the most gear dependent classes. So if you're falling a few levels behind on your gear, it's going to show a lot more than, say, if the healer is falling behind or if the DPS is falling behind. If you don't meet the DPS checks, it could be for any number of reasons. If the healer can't keep up with healing, it might be because they're focusing more on DPS, or maybe your gear's not that great. But if the tank is dying quickly, even with the healer healing, the issue does fall onto the tank more often than not. It is the fact that you need to upgrade your gear. And even stuff like rings and bracelets are really important to keep up to date. I'm not going to say buy the crafted gear every level as soon as new gear unlocks, but up to level 50 you can afford to be within a 5 level difference of gear. Once you get into 50 to 60 range, you start moving on to the expansions. It's important to try to keep your gear within 2 or 3 levels. A new gear set's offered every 2 levels, so maybe start getting that gear set. You don't need the full set of gear, but you can start upgrading some pieces, and then when the next set comes out, you get older pieces replaced until you can eventually get your level 60, 70, 80 gear. On the bright side, since you are tank, you're most often going to be getting that Venture in Need bonus, so any tomestones you're going to be getting extra of. You're going to be getting company seals that you can use to get items to sell in the marketplace for Gil. And since you're going to be running quite a few dungeons, you'll get a bunch of loot you can trade in with your Grand Company for a bunch. I really don't know if there's too much more to talk about in terms of basic tanking important knowledge that doesn't deserve its own video, so I'll just go ahead and provide a little bit of commentary on the rest of the dungeon. If you're just watching for my more advanced basic video talking about the theory of tanking, you can go ahead and stop watching. That's 100% complete. I'll see you next time. My next video's when to do a big pull, when not to, going into more specifics of it. I'll see you there. And if you're watching to figure out, you know, the rest of this dungeon, see what it's like, so you can pretend you know what you're doing first time you go through. I'm just gonna start giving a little bit of commentary about this dungeon. Important thing to know, not really important, but fun part of this dungeon nobody ever does. You can see all the different branches on the minimap in the bottom right screen. One of these leads to the hole. It's actually that gate I just glanced towards. That's a really weird, creepy little optional area. You rescue a bunch of slaves that these pirates have. Just a lot of the women are crying and are telling you some of the things that they had to do. And it's a really sad area. Once you do it, you sometimes feel obligated to go back and free all those women just because you know what they've been through. And if you don't free them now, maybe some more pirates will come back later. So you're gonna kill this guy because he's gonna drop a key. And it's really important that somebody grabs this key, because otherwise you're wasting 30 seconds running this game and then running back to grab the key because you got somebody else grabbed it. So usually as tank, I'll just go ahead and stop and pick it up. Some people expect the tank to do things like that, some people expect the healer. Honestly, just do it yourself. That way you know somebody's getting it done. So this is almost the exact same rotation on Paladin, by the way. You have your shield lob ability that throws your shield out, that's your ranged pull. You have some ability I haven't learned yet. I stopped playing Paladin with the introduction of Shadowbringers. So I have not learned the name of the AoE ability, but there is a circular AoE ability you spin around. And then you've got your 1-2 combo. So with this boss, you want to pull everything into the corner gate over here. And that's because about halfway through, the boss is going to start summoning a couple of dogs that come through. And it's just really nice to be right next to the gate. You can grab them before anybody else starts taking aggro. And it just speeds up the process. Figuring out where to pull certain bosses is a really nice thing to do for tanking, just so that you can make the dungeon easier for yourself and your healers. And sometimes it's just making it easier for DPS. Perhaps the boss has AoE abilities that they use. You can notice that whenever I'm tanking, I have the boss pulled away from all the other players. That way, if there's any frontal abilities, the boss doesn't hit any of my allies with it. That's just something you kind of pick up doing while tanking, because you'll start tanking if you don't notice. DPS or two will start running and you'll just think, oh, maybe I'll move away, and that solves that issue. It's really not anything that's super important. It's a courtesy thing. Again, not gonna throw shade on DPS, but they're not expected to dodge optional abilities that shouldn't be thrown at them in the first place, and it just creates strain on the healer if they decide they're gonna sit through it and take damage. There's a lot of control in tanking, but really it's your job as tank is to make the healer's life as easy as possible. So this is actually cutting it close towards the end of the dungeon, as you can see by the timer. This is one of the few dungeons that have a lot of optional enemies. You can see I'm just going to ignore that entire area to the right. I think there's 2 groups of enemies I skipped by doing that. If you want to do a full clear and get that little bit of extra experience, it's easy fights, a little bit of experience for you, but there's really nothing worthwhile there. And it's often better to just finish off the dungeon and get moving on to the next one. So there's not too much more to ramble on about here. Uh, this is just going to be a little bit of commentary on dungeon design. When this dungeon first came out, I thought it was not when it first came out, when the game first launched with this dungeon, I thought it was a really cool dungeon. There's a mechanic here on the boss that you had to do, and I just thought it was so cool doing it. But as people leveled up and as the game progressed, the power level of the players kind of started to exceed the intended power of these early dungeons. So a lot of mechanics for these early dungeons you can just ignore entirely, which takes a little bit of fun out of the dungeon. But since you kill the boss so fast, it doesn't matter. There's really no sense in doing it. It's really silly that I do a ready check and a cooldown here, but it's just a habit I've gotten into with the higher level dungeons. I keep them on my hotbar along with all my markers. It's just something I do, and if you don't like taking an extra 5 seconds to make sure everybody's ready, you can just hop in and hope that your healer's ready, and as long as your healer's ready, your DPS can catch up. So the optional mechanic in this dungeon is those unnatural ripples. You can see some of them have some bubbles coming up. If you leave them too long without somebody interacting, and that's usually the healer, they start to spawn small enemies that will come, and I say small, but they're the normal strength enemies. They do a good chunk of damage every time they hit you, so you want to try to keep them from spawning. But with the power level of everybody here, you see you get the boss completely killed. One just spawned in, 2 more just spawned, but the boss is already dead before they can make it to killing any players. So that's your first dungeon. That's Sastasha. It's really an easy dungeon, very straightforward. Most dungeons are just as straightforward, not too much to worry about. You learn the boss mechanics, and really you can breeze through any dungeon. I'm not saying you need to look up video guides for every dungeon, but you can just pull up like the wiki, read real quick, be like, oh, you have to out DPS this ability, and that's everything you need to know. So I'll see you next time in either a dungeon guide or my when to do big polls guide. I really hope if anybody stuck around this long, they learned something from watching that, and I'll see you next time.